All right. So, domestic phase is over the moment Japan signs that treaty with Britain. The foreign policy phase has to do with Japan believes it needs an empire, and its neighborhood is a mess. China is imploding for various reasons, which I will get to, and Korea is even worse. And China, because it's having a massive civil wars throughout China, can no longer fulfill its suzerain role to stabilize Korea. And the Korean royal house is busy mailing package bombs to each other. I kid you not, they're blowing each other up. What Japan is terribly concerned about is that Russia might try to fill this power vacuum. Why would Japan think that? Well, it's the Trans-Siberian Railway. That Russia decides in 1891 it's going to build a Trans-Siberian Railway. To exactly what? There is no Russian population out there. And Japan understands exactly what it is. It's a bid for empire in Asia, because once Russia completes this thing, it's going to overturn the Asian balance of power, because Russia is going to be able to deploy troops where nobody else can. Therefore, treaty revision happens on the 16th of July, 1894. That's when it's signed on the dotted line with Britain. 9 days later, Japan fires the opening shots of the First Sino-Japanese War. And the Japanese fight 3 wars of Russian containment. I'm going to talk to you about the 2 that went well for them today. The third one's a whole other topic. The first one's the First Sino-Japanese War, when little Japan defeats the greatest land power of Asia, China. Incredible. The second one, which I'll get to a decade later, is the Russo-Japanese War, when the Japanese defeat, spoiler alert, Russia, the greatest land empire of Europe. Amazing that they can do this. And the third one does not go nearly as well. That would be the Second Sino-Japanese War from 1931 to 1945 that morphs into World War II that ruins the Japanese, but it's a different topic. First Sino-Japanese War, to let you know what happened in it. It's comprised of 2 pairs of key battles. There are other battles as well, but this is a good way to understand it. The first battle is at Pyongyang. The Japanese defeat the Chinese army, which takes off and retreats all the way over the border river, which is the Yalu, back into Chinese territory. So Japan has actually achieved its war objective, which was to remove Korea from the Chinese sphere of influence. Battle number 1, they've already done it. And the second battle occurs within the week, the same week in mid-September 1894, it's the Battle of the Yalu, where the Japanese Navy triumphs the Chinese Navy, which, believe it or not, in this day, both countries had state-of-the-art navies. And Japan trounces it and gets command of the sea. That's terribly important for Japan. For Japan to reach the theater here, it's got to cross the sea. If there's a hostile navy out and about, it can sink troop transport, supplies, and other things. So it's very important to get rid of hostile navy. Well, the reason it gets command of the sea is because Chinese decide they're never going to engage with the Japanese Navy ever again, and they duck into port. And the Japanese are going to solve that problem for them. There are a second pair of battles which are fought over the winter of 1894-95. China only has 1 naval refitting station where you can actually fix large ships. That's at Port Arthur. And they will take it by land, the same way they're going to take it in the Russo-Japanese War. The Chinese fleet, what's left of it, flees to Weihai, hang out in port. Japan lands an army on the Shandong Peninsula there, and also it blockades with its navy, and then the army turns the landward guns on the ships and port, and they sink them all. And that is the end of that war. Okay, here's what Japan got out of this war. And what I got is a very simple framework: domestic, regional, international. This is a way to help you remember what I'm going to tell you. 3-part frameworks are helpful for getting information to other people. Domestically, this victory in this war validated a very controversial westernization program. All those Meiji reforms, which sound so great in retrospect, actually the Japanese population didn't like them. Who wants their kids being sent to elementary school if they were working on the farm before? And who wants this westernized curriculum? Who likes Westerners anyway? And people are wearing all this Western clothing and stuff. It's crazy land. Why would anyone like that? Once Japan wins this war and trounces China, a lot of Japanese have second thoughts about this. They're quite proud of their achievements, and it vastly increases the prestige of the military, particularly the army. And this is going to have bad follow-on effects for civil-military relations, because it's going to increase military power over civil power, but it takes a while to play out. Regionally, Japan's replacing China as the dominant power, and Japan's getting the beginnings of its empires, Taiwan and the Pescadores. Internationally, Japan becomes a recognized great power. And what's my proof? It would be the 1902 Anglo-Japanese alliance, which is Britain's only long-term alliance between the Napoleonic Wars and World War I, alliance with Japan. However, this war gets the eye of Mordor turned onto them because Russia is going, whoa, rising power in Asia, potential two-front war problem for us with Europe in the West and whatever the Japanese think they're doing. And that triggers a Russo-Japanese arms race, and Russia, the eye of Mordor, turns from Europe to Asia. And that's going to be problematic. So now my transition sentence, I've done part number one. Not only did Japan westernize its institutions in order to overturn the balance of power, but it also mastered grand strategy and integrated multiple instruments of national power. And here we go on that one. Marshal Yamagata, who was the writer of war plans for the very successful Sino-Japanese War, he predicted another war within the decade, and the Russo-Japanese War came right on time. And in the meantime, Japan prepared for war, and it integrated such instruments of national power as diplomacy, intelligence, military, economics. I'm going to go through each in turn, starting with diplomacy. Here you have Sun Tzu, who's China's big guru, art of war, who's talking about it's really important to disrupt alliances. In modern terminology, that would be isolating the adversary, that might be a good thing to do. And that's the purpose of the Anglo-Japanese alliance. How does that work? What it says, its terms say that if more than one European power comes to Asia to fight Japan, that means Russia plus one European buddy, then Britain is going to weigh in on Japan's side. So Britain is the number one power in Europe. So why would you ever want to help Russia out? Because it won't go well with you if Britain is on Japan's side. This alliance goes into effect from 1902 to 1907. It's a 5-year event, opening a window of opportunity for Japan to sort out its empire in Asia. But the Trans-Siberian Railway, when it gets completed, is going to threaten to close that window. And here's why. The Trans-Siberian Railway in those days, it's not north of the Amur, it's actually straight through Manchuria, this Chinese Eastern Railway. It's Russia's bid for empire of trying to control Manchuria. And it was unfinished. It hadn't been double-tracked, so that means you're always having to push trains off so other trains can pass them in the other direction. It's missing its Lake Baikal link. Don't think lake, think Switzerland. Lake Baikal is about the size of Switzerland. And the Boxer Rebellion, the Al-Qaeda of their day, and I'll get to them, had destroyed much of the track, really upsetting the Russians. As a result of all of this, at the beginning of the Russo-Japanese War, which begins in 1904, the carrying capacity of that railway was only 20 to 40,000 men per month to the front. By the end of the war, the last battle, it's 100,000 men per month. If those numbers had been available at the beginning of the war, Japan would have faced numerically superior Russians from start to finish and would have been in a world of hurt. So Japan has got a window of opportunity that it's worrying about sorting things out. In addition, Japan engages in a really big military buildup. It gets a really big indemnity from the First Sino-Japanese War, and it spends it, and that spending is finished in around 1901, meaning it's about ready to go to war. At the time the war breaks out, Russian naval assets in Asia were about 3/4 those of Japan, but Russia was scheduled to surpass Japan's naval assets by about 1905. Again, you could see this window of opportunity threatening to shut. So if you look at it, Japan's window of opportunity of getting its empire, if that's what it thinks it wants, you've got to have treaty vision in place. You've got to isolate Russians, make sure that there's going to be no other power interfering in these things. You got to have your rearmament program. But look, this window is very short. It's going to close in 1905-ish. And when you think of windows of opportunities, what they mean is whatever it is you plan to do has to be completed before it slams shut. If you're on the wrong side of the window, which is what happens to Japan in the Second Sino-Japanese War, you are in a world of hurt. In addition, what it means is actually time is on the side of your adversary. It is a sign of weakness, not strength. The Japanese are looking at the Russians who are procrastinating. The Japanese are telling them, hey, we will trade recognition of your dominance of Manchuria if you'll recognize our dominance in Korea. The Russians didn't want to do anything. They're procrastinating and trying to go beyond this window. And the Japanese are thinking, we got to sort it out before that happens. So another element of national power are psychological psyops, as the U.S. military likes to call them, psychological operations. And the Japanese were engaged in a really wide array of them, both at the front in Russia and across the Russian Empire. At the front, the Japanese were secreting in all kinds of postcards for the Russian recruits there, showing the great life as a POW in rather posh Japanese accommodations, as opposed to the really bad life of getting disabled or killed in the front. Meanwhile, Russia was I think there are only 3 European countries, including Russia, that lacked a legislature in this period. I think Montenegro is one of them, and maybe the Ottoman Empire might be the other one. Japan had a legislature. Russian population's sick of it. The war wasn't going well, and they start hitting the streets in the Russian Revolution, and Japan wants to advertise that to the troops. You want things to be stirred up in Russia so that Russia has to pull troops back into European Russia. So they're doing all of that. And then this gentleman, he was a colonel back in the day, Colonel Akashi, but he's a general by the time this picture is taken of him. He's working in the Japanese legation in Stockholm, and he's busy cutting checks to Finnish and Polish revolutionaries who are part of the Russian Empire and want out, trying to stir things up there to have Russia have to be forced to pull the troops out of Asia. And then the Japanese have this gentleman in their employ and a lot of other people, Yuan Shikai. He is key in overthrowing the Qing dynasty. He becomes China's first president. But back in the day, he's running reconnaissance missions for the Japanese, telling them what the Russians are up to. And then, and when little detachments of Russian troops try to go out and about, these people are harassing them, which doesn't help Russian morale. Also, the Japanese are being really good about purchases from Manchurians. They aren't just taking things from people, they're actually paying. So they're triggering an economic boom in Manchuria, which means locals like them. And then the Japanese also figure how to tap into Russian fleet communications so they know where the Russian fleet is most convenient. So this is the information element of national power. And then there's economics. 2/5 of this war for the Japanese side is paid for with loans. So if they don't get the loans, they can't wage the war. In fact, one of the reasons Russia has to call it quits at the end of the war is when it tries to raise a final loan, it failed. No one will pay for it. But the Japanese loans depend on battlefield success, as do interest rates. So if you are successful in the field, the interest rates go down. So Japan is doing quite well with all of this. So if you sum it all up, you can go the Japanese use diplomacy to isolate their adversary with this UK alliance. They use all these psychological operations to promote revolution and desertions. They're using the military instrument to fund their rearmament, and then they've got the economics going with all of these loans. The U.S. military is really partial to a Reagan-era acronym of DIME, right? You can see here that D is for diplomacy, I is for information, M is for military, E is economics. Sounds like a bad, I don't know, cheerleading routine. It's inadequate. It may be a place to start. It's cute and all that stuff, but cute does not mean complete. Think about it. One of the most important factors in this war, bar none, certainly for Russia, is railways. I don't see an R in there or anything. So by all means, this is better than only looking at military factors, but it's in